The elevator opened directly into silence. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that had been curated, maintained, enforced. 42 floors above the city, the penthouse existed in a register of its own, floor-to-ceiling glass, marble so pale it looked carved from winter itself. Every surface clean, every object chosen with the precision of someone who believed that beauty, if controlled tightly enough, might substitute for something else. She stepped out slowly, pulling her canvas bag behind her, and tried not to let her face show what she was feeling. It was not envy, it was closer to vertigo. The agency had briefed her that morning in the kind of clipped, careful language people use when they expect you to be overwhelmed. Private client. High standards. You will prepare dinner 5 nights a week. The kitchen has been fully stocked according to specification. You will arrive by 4. You will be gone by 9. You will not touch anything that is not the kitchen. She had nodded and written none of it down because she remembered everything. That had always been her way, absorbing details quietly, filing them somewhere behind her eyes where no one else could reach them. The kitchen, when she found it, was extraordinary. Custom cabinetry in matte black. A range that cost more than her mother's car. Knives so perfectly balanced, they felt like extensions of thought rather than metal. She ran a fingertip along the counter edge and felt the cold precision of it. She had grown up cooking in a kitchen where the tile was cracked and the oven ran 10 degrees too hot, and you learned to compensate, to adjust, to read the heat by the smell of things rather than the numbers on a dial. That kitchen had smelled of her grandmother's hands and old cast iron, and the particular sweetness of bread that had been given enough time to rise properly. This kitchen smelled of nothing at all. She began to work. He arrived at 7:45, later than expected. She heard the elevator before she heard him, that same enveloping silence, and then the particular quality of footsteps that belonged to someone who was accustomed to being the most important thing in any room. She plated the last element and stepped back without turning around. "You may leave it on the table," he said. "Not thank you, not good evening." She turned anyway, not in defiance, just to acknowledge the presence of another human being in the way she always had. He was already moving away, jacket still on, phone already raised, the meal she had spent 3 hours preparing reduced in his orbit to background detail. She left without speaking. On the bus ride back to her apartment, the small one with the water stain on the ceiling, and the neighbor who played guitar badly past midnight, she stared out the rain-blurred window and thought about that kitchen. All that cold, expensive space. All that silence where warmth should have been. She thought she understood him a little already. She wasn't sure that was a good thing. The second evening she arrived early, not because she was eager, or not only because of that, but because she had been thinking all day about the kitchen, about what it was missing. Not equipment, not ingredients. The pantry was stocked with things that cost more than her monthly rent. What it was missing was use. The smell of anything that had ever been touched by real hunger, real need, real love. She set her bag down and opened the refrigerator and stood there a long moment before she began. She cooked differently that night. Not outside the terms of what she had been asked to provide. The brief had specified elegant, contemporary, appropriate for a man of his position, but inside those terms she pressed closer to something honest. She reduced a broth from bones she had brought herself, wrapped in paper in the bottom of her bag. She made a small sauce from preserved lemon and herbs she'd had dried on her windowsill. Nothing on the plate looked different from what was expected, but it was different. He arrived at 7:30 this time. She heard the elevator and began transferring things to the table with the same quiet efficiency, the same careful placement. She was sliding the last element into position when she heard him stop, not at the table, just inside the room. She looked up. He was reading the plate. That was the only way she could describe it. Not looking at it the way he had the night before, cataloging and dismissing, but actually reading it. He looked at her once, briefly, with an expression she could not fully interpret. It was not warmth, but it was attention. "Different from last night," he said. "Yes." She didn't apologize. She waited. He said nothing else. He sat down. She gathered her things with the same unhurried quiet and left. And she told herself the small knot of hope forming in her chest was unprofessional and foolish, and she should dissolve it before it caused any trouble. She did not dissolve it. On the third evening, he was not there at all. She cooked anyway, covered the plate, left instructions for reheating, written in clear handwriting on a card beside the food, and wiped down every surface until the kitchen looked as though she had never existed. She wondered, riding the bus home through streets slicked silver with rain, whether he had eaten the previous night's meal cold or not at all, whether he had read her instructions or set them aside. She thought again about that kitchen, about what it would mean to actually inhabit it, to stop being careful and polished and invisible, and simply cook the way she knew how, the way her grandmother had taught her, with both hands in flour and nothing measured, and the whole house filling with something that was almost indistinguishable from safety. She thought about it the way you think about something impossible, the way you let yourself imagine it for one unguarded moment alone, before the bus stops and the cold air comes in and you stand up and become practical again. On the fourth evening, she brought the flour. She told herself it was practical. The whole wheat she used for the old bread was cheaper to buy in bulk, and she had nowhere to store bulk flour in her apartment, where the kitchen was the size of a generous thought, and the cabinet above the refrigerator was already claimed by things she could not throw away. She told herself she would use only what she needed and take the rest home in the bag. She told herself this several times on the bus, the flour sitting in her lap like ballast, and she believed it less each time she said it. He was not there again. She knew his schedule by now the way you learn a place without meaning to, by accumulation. The car that arrived at 9, the lights that changed at certain hours, the faint sound of his voice through walls when a call ran long. On evenings he was absent. The penthouse held its silence differently. Not like a room waiting for its occupant, but like a room that had decided it, was done waiting, and simply become itself. She moved through it more slowly on those nights. She noticed things. She cooked his dinner. She plated it the way she always did, clean lines and careful color, everything as it should be. She covered it, wrote the card, set it in its place. And then she stood in that kitchen for a long moment, both hands flat on the cool stone counter, and looked at the bag of flour. It was past 10 o'clock. She knew it was foolish before she began, and she began anyway. She pushed the center island stools aside to make room, and she knelt on the marble floor the way her grandmother had always knelt on the tile back. Home, low enough to feel the work in your shoulders, close enough to the dough, to know it by smell as much as by touch. She had no yeast, but she had enough. She mixed everything by hand in the large ceramic bowl she had moved from the cabinet where it lived. Useless and beautiful, and when the dough came together under her palms, she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. She did not hurry. The bread needed time she technically did not have, and she gave it anyway, setting it near the oven's ambient warmth, the way her grandmother had set things near the radiator in winter. While it rested, she cleaned everything once, then sat on the floor with her back against the island and her knees drawn up, listening to the apartment breathe around her. The city was a distant suggestion 40 floors below. The kitchen smelled of wheat and something deeper, older, a scent she associated with being a child and not yet knowing what it meant to be tired. She was not supposed to be here like this, not on the floor. Not with flour still ghosting her wrists and both shoes set aside because her grandmother had never baked in shoes. She was still there when she heard the elevator. The sound moved through the apartment before he did. The elevator released its soft hydraulic exhale. Then the doors parted, and she heard the particular silence of a man who has stopped walking because something was not what he expected. she did not stand. She told herself it was because sudden movement would look more guilty than stillness. But the truth was simpler. Her legs had gone cold against the marble, and her body had made its decision before her mind could override it. She stayed where she was, back against the island, knees up, the ceramic bowl resting a foot from her hip, the dough covered with a clean cloth in the low warmth near the oven. Her shoes were still beside her. She was still precisely herself, and there was no version of the next 30 seconds that would change that. She heard him cross the living room. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. The pause before he spoke was long enough to be its own sentence. "What," he said, "is on my floor?" It was not quite a question. The tone belonged to a man who had arrived home expecting order, and found something he could not immediately categorize, which was, she understood, perhaps the most disorienting thing that could happen to a person who controlled everything within 40 floors of sky. "Doh," she said. Another pause. "You are sitting on my kitchen floor." "Yes, at—" She heard him glance somewhere, check something. "At 20 minutes past midnight." "The bread needs another 40 minutes before it goes in," she said. I didn't want to leave it alone. The silence that followed was different from the first one. The first had been sharp with the specific irritation of a man whose expectations had been violated. This one had a texture she could not quite name. She looked up then. She had been avoiding it, but she looked up. He was still in his jacket, which meant he had come from somewhere, not from sleep. His tie was loosened but not removed, and he was looking at her the way a person looks at something they have already decided they do not understand. His eyes moved from her face to the bowl to the cloth to her bare feet to the flour along her wrists. "You don't have yeast," he said finally. She blinked. "I used what you had. I know what I have." He was not looking away. "There is no yeast in this kitchen. I don't keep it." "No," she agreed. "Wild starter, salt, heat from the oven, time." He looked at the covered bowl as though it had just become a different object than the one he had been staring at for the past 30 seconds. "That takes longer," he said. "It does. You started this before your shift ended." It was not a question either. She did not answer it like one. She simply met his eyes and held them, and the kitchen filled quietly with the smell that had been building all evening. Warm, ancient, impossible to be angry at. And she watched something move through his expression that he did not seem to know was moving. He crossed his arms. It was the gesture of a man who had made a decision but had not yet announced it, and she recognized it because it had seen it on the faces of every employer who had ever looked at her the way people look at something small that has taken up too much space. She waited. "How long?" he said. "Another 2 hours, maybe less. The kitchen is warm." He looked toward the window. The city below was still alive. 100,000 lit windows, 1,000 conversations, none of them his. He looked back. "You planned this," he said. Not an accusation exactly. Something more careful than that. "I planned dinner," she said. "What I served you was what you asked for." This, she gestured once, briefly, at the bowl, at herself kneeling on his marble floor, at the entire quiet scene. "This was for me." He was quiet for a long moment. "You bake for yourself," he said, "in someone else's kitchen, at midnight." She did not look away from him. "I bake when I need to remember something." Remember what? She thought about how to say it, whether to say it, and decided honesty was less dangerous than cleverness. "That I know how to make something from almost nothing. That I learned it from someone who never had much either. That it still works even here." She looked down at the bowl, then back up at him, especially here. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, not yet. Something earlier than warmth. The place where warmth comes from, before a person decides whether to let it. He stood there for another moment, then walked to the far counter and poured himself a glass of water from the tap. Not the filtered carafe. The tap, she noticed. She did not say so. "I have a meeting at 7, he said. "I'll be gone before 6. "That's not what I meant." She looked at him. He set the glass down. "I meant—" He stopped. Whatever he meant, it was apparently not something he had practiced saying. "The bread. I want to see if it— I want to know how it turns out. She held very still. I'll be in my office, he said. You don't need to knock. If you, another stop. He reached up and straightened his tie slightly, which he had no reason to do at midnight in his own kitchen. If it's ready before I leave for the meeting. She nodded once. He walked to the door, then paused without turning around. My grandmother, he said, and then stopped there, the sentence unfinished, hanging in the warm air between them, too large to complete and too honest to take back. She did not move, she did not ask. She understood that some things are said in pieces, offered only in fragments the first time, and that pushing would break whatever small thing had just been placed, carefully and without ceremony, on the counter between them. She stayed kneeling. She waited for the bread. She listened to his footsteps disappear down the hall. The bread needed 40 more minutes. She knew this without looking at a clock. She had known it since childhood, the way her grandmother had taught her, not by time but by feel, by the particular heaviness of the dough when you pressed two fingers gently into the surface and watched how slowly it pushed back. The penthouse kitchen was warm. The oven held its temperature precisely, its digital display blinking steady numbers she barely needed. She had learned to bake in a kitchen with no thermometer at all. She settled back against the cabinet and let her shoulders drop. The sentence he had left behind was still in the room. She could feel it the way you feel a door left slightly open. The faint movement of air, through a gap, a presence rather than a sound. My grandmother. Two words and then silence, the kind of silence that says more than the sentence would have. She had not asked because she already understood the shape of what it was. She had seen it before. Not in men like him, she had never known men like him, but in people who carry something private and enormous and have learned, over long years, that speaking it aloud tends to make it smaller than it deserves to be. So they hold it. They hold it until something breaks the seal without warning. A smell, a sound. Flour on a marble floor. She rose from her knees and checked the dough one final time. She covered it with the cloth. Through the wall she could hear almost nothing. Just the faintest suggestion of a chair adjusting. A single quiet drawer opening and closing. He was at his desk. She imagined him sitting the way he had stood in the kitchen. Very straight, very controlled, with that one loosened button as the only evidence that something had shifted. She filled a glass of water and stood at the window while she drank it. The city below was silver and sleepless. Lights moved along avenues she could not name. People heading somewhere or heading home. The world continuing its ordinary business 26 floors beneath a kitchen where bread was rising, and a sentence had been left unfinished on purpose. She thought about what it costs a person to stop mid-sentence and walk away. She thought it probably costs more than finishing. She rinsed the glass. She folded the flour cloth. She wiped the small circle of dust from the floor. When the bread was ready, she would know. She would feel it in the kitchen itself, a change in the quality of the warmth, a slight deepening of the smell, something that could not be measured but could absolutely be recognized if you had been paying attention long enough. She thought he was a man who had stopped paying attention to certain things. She did not know how long ago. She did not know what had caused it, but she thought, and she was careful with the thought, the way you are careful with something fragile, that tonight, in this kitchen, something in him had briefly turned back toward the light. The bread came out at 20 past midnight. She knew before she opened the oven door. The smell had shifted, deeper, slower, the kind of warmth that does not announce itself, but simply fills a room the way Sunday mornings fill a childhood. She lifted the loaf with both hands wrapped in the linen cloth and set it on the wooden board she had found in the back of a low cabinet, behind the expensive things, where the useful things always hide. It was not beautiful in the way his kitchen was beautiful. It was round and cracked along the top, where the crust had split during the final rise, and one side was slightly higher than the other, because the oven floor had a faint tilt she had compensated for too late. It was the kind of bread that belongs on a table with a checked cloth and a window with a garden beyond it. It did not belong here, surrounded by brushed steel and ambient light and 42 stories of empty silence. And yet here it was, breathing in his kitchen. She covered it lightly with the cloth and stepped back. Her knees ached from the floor. Her back ached from the bending. She was aware of how she must look. Flour on her wrists, her hair pulled back unevenly, the plain fabric of her clothes, carrying the smell of the oven into every quiet corner of the room. She was aware that she had spent the last several hours making something with her hands on the floor of a penthouse that cost more per month than she earned in 2 years. She did not feel ashamed of this. She was not sure why. Perhaps because the bread was real. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps. He moved too quietly for footsteps to announce him. It was a different signal. The particular quality of the air in a room changes when someone enters it who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. A kind of pressure, a kind of weight that belongs to the person, not the space. He stopped at the entrance to the kitchen. He had changed into something simpler. No jacket, no tie, the collar of his shirt open at the throat. He looked, she thought, more like a person, less like a position. His eyes went immediately to the loaf on the board, and something moved through his expression that he did not manage to contain in time. He said nothing. She said nothing. The bread sat between them on the counter, its cracked crust still releasing heat into the cool air, the cloth slightly fogged with warmth at the edges. He moved toward the counter, not toward her, toward the bread. He stopped close enough to it that she saw his chest rise and fall once slowly, as though he had walked somewhere very far and had only now arrived. He stood there for a long moment with his eyes closed. She waited. The city continued below them. The kitchen held its breath. Then he opened his eyes. He looked at the loaf the way a person looks at something they were certain no longer existed in the world. Not with hunger, not with appetite, with a kind of disoriented recognition, as though he had opened a drawer he stopped opening years ago and found something inside, it that had no right to still be there. She watched his hand move before he seemed aware it was moving. He reached out and touched the crust, not to break it, not to take from it, just to touch it. One finger tracing the ridge where it had split open during baking, the crack that ran from one end to the other, dark and uneven, the kind of imperfection that only comes from heat, doing what heat does when nothing interferes with it. He said quietly, "My grandmother made bread like this." She did not respond. She understood that he was not speaking to her. Not exactly. He was speaking to the thing the bread had opened in him, and she was simply close enough to hear it. She kept a kitchen in the back of the house, he continued. Not the main kitchen, smaller. She said the big kitchen was for the staff. The little one was hers. He withdrew his hand. I used to sit on the floor in there. She never sent me out. Something shifted in the room, not dramatically. The way light shifts in the afternoon, barely perceptible, but everything looks slightly different afterward, and you cannot say when exactly it changed. She moved to the drawer and found the serrated knife and cut a slice without asking. She set it on the board in front of him with nothing on it. No plate, no napkin, no ceremony. He looked at it, then he picked it up with his hands and ate it standing at the counter. She turned and began cleaning the flour from the marble floor, which she had been meaning to do since before any of this started. She did not watch him. She gave him the dignity of not being watched. She scrubbed at the pale dusting of flour along the grout lines with a damp cloth, and she heard him behind her take a second slice, without asking, the clean sound of bread being pulled apart. When she finally stood and turned, the slice was gone. He was looking out the window at the city. His expression had settled into something she had not seen on him before. Not softness, exactly. More like the absence of armor. The face a person has when they forget briefly that they are supposed to be protected. He did not thank her. She did not expect him to. Thanks would have made it smaller than it was. After a moment, he said without turning, "What else do you know how to make?" It was not quite a question. It was not quite a command. It sat somewhere between them, waiting, the way certain sentences do when the person asking them is not entirely sure what answer they are hoping for. She thought about the question for a moment before she answered. Not performing the pause, not being coy. She was actually thinking, actually taking the question seriously, because it deserved that. Soup from dried beans, she said, the kind that takes all day. Roasted tomatoes with salt and olive oil when there's nothing else worth eating. Potato dumplings my grandmother made by feel, not measure. Fried dough with honey, she paused. Dishes that don't photograph well. He turned from the window then, not all the way, just enough that she could see the side of his face, the line of his jaw, the way his mouth had changed slightly from the flat, controlled expression she had come to recognize as his default armor. Dishes that don't photograph well, he repeated. Food made for eating, she said, not for showing. Something shifted in his posture, not much, a fraction of tension leaving his shoulders. She would not have noticed it 2 weeks ago, but she had learned his silences the way you learn a difficult piece of music. Not by reading it, but by living inside it until the pauses begin to mean something. He moved away from the window and sat at the counter again, not at the formal dining end where she always set his meals, but at the kitchen side, the working side, where the mixing bowls sat, and the flour she hadn't entirely cleaned yet left a ghost of white on the dark stone. He sat there as if it were entirely ordinary, as if he had always sat there. She did not make a point of it. She began tidying the remaining things from the bread, wrapping what was left in a clean cloth the way her mother had taught her, because a good loaf deserved better than plastic wrap, which killed the crust and made the inside sweat. Her hands moved through the familiar motions without thought, and she was aware of him watching them, the way he sometimes watched the preparation of a dish with the focused, slightly unreadable attention of a man who is interested in process, but has never had occasion to learn one for himself. The soup, he said. The bean soup. How long does it actually take? If you soak the beans the night before, 6 hours minimum. If you don't, closer to 8. You can't rush it. She folded the cloth over the end of the loaf. It's not a dish you make when you want something quickly. It's a dish you make when you want to fill a whole day with something that matters. He was quiet for a moment. Make it, he said. She looked at him. Tomorrow, he added, not softening it exactly, but clarifying it, which was its own kind of softening from a man who did not soften things. She nodded once, without making anything of it. But as she turned back to the counter, she let herself feel, quietly and privately, that something had shifted in this kitchen tonight, that neither of them had words for yet. She soaked the beans that night before she left, covering them in cold water in a ceramic bowl she found at the back of the cabinet, the kind that looked like it had never been used. She set it on the lowest shelf of the refrigerator and felt the small, private satisfaction of a thing begun. She came back the next morning earlier than usual. He was already in the kitchen when she arrived, standing at the window with his coffee, still in the early morning version of himself that she had grown used to, the suit not yet fully inhabited, the stillness around him different from his evening stillness, less controlled, more native. He did not say anything when she walked in. Neither did she. She went to the refrigerator and lifted out the bowl, and the day arranged itself around that quiet beginning. The soup required patience that was almost meditative. She sautéed onions slowly, without hurrying them, until they were translucent and faintly gold. She added smoked paprika and dried thyme and let the smell build gradually, the way it was meant to. She drained the beans and added them with stock, and then there was nothing to do but wait and tend and wait again. He left for his office around 8. She stayed with the soup. He came back at noon, which surprised her. She had not expected him until evening. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the pot on the stove without commenting, but she noticed he set his briefcase down rather than keeping it in hand the way he did when he intended to leave again quickly. She said nothing. She stirred the soup and adjusted the flame. He sat at the kitchen island, not the dining table, the island, which was where she worked, and opened his laptop, which was something he had never done before. She was aware of it without acknowledging it, the way you are aware of a significant change in weather while continuing to go about your work. By 1 o'clock, the beans had fully surrendered to the broth. She ladled some into a bowl and set it in front of him without ceremony, the way it would have been served in a kitchen, where no one performed anything for anyone, where food was simply food and hunger was simply hunger. He closed the laptop. He picked up the spoon. She turned back to the stove and pretended to be occupied with something because she understood instinctively that this moment required privacy, that a man who had spent years eating in the specific loneliness of wealth needed to taste this soup without being watched. She heard the second spoonful, the third. Then, after a long silence, she heard him set the spoon down carefully, not with the finality of finished, but with the deliberateness of a man who is taking a moment before, continuing, as though the thing in the bowl required him to stop and recognize something before he could go on. She did not turn around. She kept her hands busy at the counter, rearranging things that did not need to be rearranged, because the silence behind her had a particular quality she did not trust herself to face directly. It was not the silence of indifference. It was not the silence of a man distracted by his phone or his thoughts, or the thousand invisible obligations that lived in men like him. It was the silence of someone sitting very still inside something unexpected, the way a person goes still when a song comes on, that they have not heard since they were young, and they need a moment to determine whether the feeling it brings is bearable or not. He spoke eventually, not loudly, not with the controlled authority she had grown accustomed to hearing from him in the weeks she had worked in his kitchen. He said simply that it tasted like something he remembered. She turned then, because there was no graceful way to remain with her back to a statement like that. He was still looking at the bowl, not at her. His hand rested beside it on the counter, relaxed in a way she had never seen his hands relaxed before. He was always holding something, a phone, a pen, a glass, the invisible weight of whatever next decision was forming behind his eyes. Now his hand was simply resting, open, on the marble, as though he had set something down that he had been carrying for a very long time without knowing he was carrying it. She asked, quietly, what it reminded him of. He did not answer immediately. She did not press. She had learned early that the way to make a man like him speak honestly was to make absolutely no effort to extract the honesty. Silence, offered without demand, was the only kind of space in which truth arrived willingly. He said there had been a kitchen once. Not in his life now, not in the life everyone knew about, but before. A different kitchen, smaller, with a window that faced a garden no one maintained properly, and a woman who cooked without measuring anything, by touch and familiarity, and the particular knowledge that only comes from having made the same thing 500 times. He did not say who the woman was. She did not ask, but she understood, the way you understand certain things without being told, the way the body sometimes knows before the mind has caught up, that he was describing a grief he had learned to live around rather than through, that the kitchen he was describing was a place he had sealed off at some point because to hold it open was more than he could manage, and also run the empire and also keep moving forward, always forward, because stopping meant feeling the full weight of what he had left behind. She reached across the counter without thinking and pushed the bowl gently back toward him. She told him the soup was better warm. He ate the soup warm. She watched him do it without watching him. The way you learn to give someone privacy while remaining present, and when he set the bowl down there was a long quiet that did not need to be filled. Outside the penthouse windows, the city carried on with its indifferent brightness. All those lit rectangles stacked against the dark, all those lives pressing forward without knowledge of this particular kitchen, this particular stillness, this particular man sitting with his hands around an empty bowl, as if it were something he was not ready to release. She began to clean up. It was what she did, what she had always done, and the motion of it was familiar enough to be almost comforting. But he stood and came around the counter, and without asking, without announcing himself, he picked up a cloth and dried the bowl she handed him. She did not comment on it. He did not explain it. They moved together in the quiet, the way people move when they have been honest with each other and have nothing left to perform. When the kitchen was clean, he stood at the window with his back to her, and she recognized the posture, the way it held something back even in its openness. And she understood that whatever door had come ajar tonight had not been flung wide, had not been dismantled entirely, but had been opened enough for air to pass through. And that was not nothing. That was in fact considerable. She gathered her things. He turned from the window when she moved toward the door, and he looked at her the way he had looked at the bread that first night, as if she were something he had not accounted for, and was not entirely sure what to do with, except that he was certain he did not want it to disappear. He asked her to come back, not to cook. He said it that way plainly, with the particular directness of someone who has spent enough time not saying things, and has decided in this one moment to say the thing. Not to cook, just to come back. She stood at the door and looked at him across the clean marble and the soft light and the distance between where they had each started, all the distance, all the years and choices and griefs that had made them separately into who they were now, and she thought about bread made on the floor of a cold kitchen because some things require contact with the ground to rise properly. And she thought this was perhaps one of those things, this life she had not planned and could not have imagined, this man she had not expected. She told him she would think about it. But she was already smiling when she said it, and they both knew what it meant, and the door closed softly behind her, and the city went on shining, and somewhere inside that high and quiet place, something that had been sealed, for a very long time remained gently open.